The chandeliers glittered like frozen stars above the vast marble hall of the Lockwood estate, casting their golden glow on walls lined with priceless art. The mansion was silent except for the soft ticking of an antique grandfather clock and the faint whisper of rain against the towering windows. In this world of wealth and elegance, warmth was rare, but it existed in one small, sunlit room at the end of the west corridor. There, Maria Alvarez was humming a lullaby from her childhood as she folded tiny shirts and socks. The nursery smelled faintly of lavender and baby powder, and in the middle of the room sat 6-year-old Benjamin Lockwood, legs swinging from his little chair, a wide smile lighting up his face. "Maria," he said, his eyes sparkling with curiosity, "how do you say, 'I love you,' in Spanish again?" Maria chuckled softly and knelt beside him. "Te amo, Benny, that's how you say it. Te amo," he repeated carefully, his small tongue fumbling over the sounds. "Like that, perfecto," Maria laughed, tapping his nose gently. "You learn so fast." Benjamin's cheeks flushed with pride. He adored Maria, not just because she was kind and patient, but because she made him feel safe. She had been there since the day he came into the world, rocking him through sleepless nights, wiping away his tears, and reading him stories with voices that made the characters come alive. In many ways, Maria was more family than the distant relatives who visited only for holidays. "Will you come to my school play next week?" Benjamin asked, tilting his head. Maria's heart softened. "If your papa allows it, of course I will. I wouldn't miss it for anything." Benjamin hopped off the chair and ran into her arms. "You're my favorite person in the whole world," he whispered. Maria hugged him tightly, tears stinging her eyes. "And you, mi pequeño Sol, are mine." It was a picture of innocence, a little boy and the woman who loved him like her own. But the peace of that moment shattered like glass when the nursery door slammed open. Richard Lockwood stood in the doorway, his expensive suit still crisp from a morning meeting, his expression thunderous. He surveyed the scene before him, his son nestled in the arms of a woman whose skin was darker than theirs, and his jaw tightened. "What is going on here?" he barked. Maria froze, her hands still wrapped gently around Benjamin. "Good morning, sir," she began cautiously. "We were just—" "Papa," Benjamin interrupted, beaming. "Maria's teaching me Spanish and—" "Enough." Richard's voice boomed through the room, his tone sharper than the crack of thunder outside. He strode forward and pulled Benjamin from Maria's embrace, holding him close as if shielding him from something dangerous. "Richard, please," Maria said, stepping back in confusion. "We were only—" "Only what?" he snapped, his eyes blazing with fury. "Only filling his head with nonsense. Only crossing lines that should never be crossed." Maria's heart pounded. She had endured his coldness before, the clipped orders, the disdainful glances, but there was something different now. Something darker. Then the words came, dripping with venom, words that froze the air and cut through her like a blade. "You will make my son black." The silence that followed was deafening. Benjamin blinked up at his father, confusion clouding his innocent eyes. "Daddy," he asked softly, "what does that mean?" Maria felt the floor sway beneath her. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Tears burned behind her eyes as the reality of what he'd said sank in. After all these years, after the nights she'd stayed awake rocking Benjamin through fevers, after the birthdays she'd planned when his parents were too busy, after all the love she'd poured into this family, she was still nothing more to Richard than the color of her skin. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I think you misunderstand." "I said out," Richard roared, pointing toward the door. "I don't want you near him. Not like that. Do your job, and nothing more." Benjamin squirmed in his father's arms. "Papa, don't yell at Maria. She didn't do anything wrong." Richard's grip tightened. "Because, son," he said coldly, "people like her are different. And I will not have them influencing you." Benjamin's eyes welled up. "But I like her. She loves me." Richard's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, but his pride forced the words out, "You'll understand when you're older." Maria stood silently, her hands shaking, then turned and walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. The hallway beyond felt colder than ever as she pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself. Her chest ached with a mix of humiliation and heartbreak. She had given so much to this family, and in a single moment, she had been reduced to nothing, not a caregiver, not a teacher, not someone who loved Benjamin deeply, just a color. Behind her, Benjamin's cries echoed from the nursery. "Papa, please, I want Maria." But Richard stood silent, staring at the door she had just walked through, his heart betraying a flicker of something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to regret. The days that followed were unlike any Maria had known in her years at the Lockwood mansion. The warmth that once filled the nursery had vanished, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. Maria still arrived every morning, still polished the silver and tidied the rooms, but the spark in her eyes had dimmed. She kept her distance from Benjamin now, careful not to cross any invisible lines. She spoke only when necessary, always with a quiet, trembling respect, not out of fear of losing her job, but because her heart was too wounded to risk another blow. Benjamin, on the other hand, was a storm of confusion. He wandered the halls with his stuffed bear clutched tightly to his chest, searching for Maria's familiar warmth. "Why won't you read me stories anymore?" he asked one evening, tugging at her apron as she passed. Maria's smile was faint, brittle. "I'm sorry, Benny, your papa wants me to focus on my work. But I want you," Benjamin insisted, his voice cracking with frustration. "Not just to clean, I want you to be with me like before." Maria swallowed the lump rising in her throat and forced herself to keep folding the laundry. "I want that too," she whispered. More than anything. Upstairs, Richard watched his son's growing sadness with a mixture of irritation and unease. He had expected Benjamin to move on quickly, children did, after all. But Benjamin's behavior was different now. He refused to eat at dinner, barely spoke to his tutors, and spent hours staring out the window. Even the expensive toys Richard bought failed to cheer him. "Are you still upset about that maid?" Richard asked one night as he tucked Benjamin into bed. Benjamin turned away, his small voice trembling. "She's not that maid, she's my Maria." Richard exhaled sharply, struggling to keep his patience. "Benjamin, listen to me. Maria is here to work. That's all." Benjamin sat up, his eyes fierce in a way that startled his father. "She loves me," he said firmly. "And I love her. Why is that bad?" The question stung more than Richard expected. "Because," he began, then faltered. The reason that had once seemed so clear, that Maria was different, that she would change, his son, now felt hollow when spoken aloud. He cleared his throat. "You're too young to understand." Benjamin lay back down silently, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "Maybe you're too old to understand," he whispered. The words echoed in Richard's mind long after he left the room. 3 days later, a steady rain drummed against the mansion's windows as Richard returned home early from a meeting. As he hung up his coat, faint laughter floated through the hallway, a sound that had become rare in recent days. Curious, he followed it to the kitchen. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Maria and Benjamin were at the counter, hands covered in flour, laughing as they tried to shape dough into little animal shapes. Benjamin's cheeks were streaked with white dust, his smile wide and unrestrained. "Now press here," Maria said gently, guiding his small fingers. "Yes, just like that. Perfecto, mi pequeño chef." Benjamin giggled. "Chef Benny, that's me." Richard stood in the doorway, unseen, his heart twisting. For the first time, he saw what he had refused to see before. There was nothing corrupting or dangerous about this scene. Maria wasn't changing his son, she was nurturing him, teaching him joy, patience, and love. And yet, pride surged to the surface. He cleared his throat loudly. Maria stepped back as if burned, her hands falling to her sides. "Sir," she murmured. Benjamin turned eagerly. "Papa, we're making bread together. Look." Richard's face hardened. "Maria, I thought I told you to stay away from him." Benjamin's smile vanished. "But I asked her to." Richard ignored his son, his voice cold. "Do you think it's appropriate to overstep your place in this house?" Maria's heart pounded. "Sir, I never mean disrespect. I only do what Benjamin asks." "I would never." "I don't care," Richard interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut. "You work here, that is all. You do not belong here." For a moment, the kitchen was silent but for the sound of rain on the windows. Then Maria did something she had never done before. She looked him straight in the eyes. Her voice trembled, but each word carried the weight of truth. "Mr. Lockwood," she said softly, "I have rocked your son to sleep more times than I can count. I have held his hand through fevers. I have dried his tears and taught him to be kind when the world is cruel. If all that is not belonging, then I don't know what is." Richard blinked, stunned by her courage. But Maria wasn't finished. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "And if loving your child with all my heart could make him black, then I pray he grows darker every single day." The words struck him like a blow. Richard's throat tightened, his composure cracking. Benjamin's small voice broke the silence. Papa, why would that be bad? Richard looked at his son, truly looked at him, innocent, trusting, incapable of hate. And for the first time in his life, he had no answer. None that didn't sound cruel and hollow, even to himself. He turned away abruptly and left the kitchen without a word, his heart pounding against his ribs. Upstairs, alone in his study, he poured himself a drink, but the burn of the whiskey did nothing to drown out the words echoing in his mind. If loving your child could make him black, then I pray he grows darker every single day. For the first time in years, Richard Lockwood felt shame, deep, suffocating shame, not for Maria's place in his house, but for the ugliness he had allowed to take root in his own heart. The rain finally stopped 2 days later, leaving the Lockwood estate washed clean under a pale autumn sun. But inside the mansion, the storm still lingered, not in the weather, but in Richard Lockwood's heart. The words Maria had spoken refused to leave his mind. If loving your child with all my heart could make him black, then I pray he grows darker every single day. They played on a loop, louder than the ticking of the grandfather clock, louder than the rustle of the newspaper he couldn't focus on. For the first time in his life, Richard began questioning the beliefs he had clung to so stubbornly. Where had they come from? His father, perhaps, a man who used to mutter hateful words about people, beneath them over Sunday dinners. Or from the boardrooms he'd sat in, where men like him valued power over people. He had always told himself these beliefs were just the way of the world. But now, looking into Benjamin's tear-streaked face and remembering Maria's trembling words, that justification felt small. Pathetic, even. Meanwhile, Maria tried to convince herself to leave. She'd even packed a small bag one night, standing in the servants' quarters with shaking hands. It's time, she whispered to herself. I don't belong here. But each time she reached for the doorknob, Benjamin's face flashed in her mind, his laughter, his hugs, the way he'd call her "Am I Maria?" She had promised herself she would never abandon him, not when he needed her most. So she stayed, though her heart ached every time she passed Richard in the halls. They spoke only in brief, polite exchanges, and even those were strained. But Benjamin, sweet, persistent Benjamin, refused to let things remain broken. One afternoon, Richard stood in his office, staring blankly at a stack of papers he hadn't read. A small knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called. Benjamin shuffled inside, dragging his stuffed bear behind him. He climbed onto the leather chair opposite his father's desk and sat silently for a long moment. Something wrong, champ? Richard asked, trying to sound casual. Benjamin looked up, his little brow furrowed. Are you mad at Maria forever? Richard froze. No, he said slowly. Why do you ask? Because you don't talk to her anymore, Benjamin whispered. And she looks sad all the time. And, his voice wavered. And I miss the way our house used to feel. Richard swallowed hard. I know, he murmured. I miss it too. Benjamin's next words hit him harder than he expected. Maria says love makes people better. Even if they're different. He hugged his bear tightly. I want to be better, Papa. Something inside Richard cracked open. In his son's innocent plea, he saw a version of himself he wanted to be, a man who didn't cling to hatred, who didn't pass on old poisons. A father his son could be proud of. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of amber and violet, Richard made a decision he'd never thought he'd make. He walked down the long hallway toward the nursery, the one place in the house he had avoided since that awful day. His heart thudded with each step. Maria was there, folding Benjamin's pajamas neatly into a drawer. She turned when she heard him, startled, her hands pausing mid-fold. Sir, she said automatically, her voice polite but distant. Please, Richard said quietly, don't call me, sir. Not right now. Maria blinked, confused. What would you like me to call you? Just, Richard. He exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing on his chest. Maria, I came to say I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, fragile and trembling. Maria stared at him as if she weren't sure she'd heard correctly. I was wrong, he continued, his voice breaking. I said things no decent man should ever say. I let ignorance speak louder than my heart. And in doing so, I hurt someone who has done nothing but love my son as her own. Tears welled in Maria's eyes. Richard, he stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. If Benjamin grows up to have even half of your kindness, half of your strength, I will consider myself a lucky father. And if loving him makes him more like you, then I hope he becomes exactly that. Maria, pressed a hand to her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. For years she had endured his coldness, his disdain. She had never expected this, an apology, spoken not with arrogance, but with humility. Just then, Benjamin burst into the room, his face lighting up when he saw them together. "Papa, are you still mad at Maria?" Richard knelt beside his son, his voice soft and unsteady. "No, Benny, I'm not mad. I was wrong to ever be angry at someone who loves you so much." Benjamin's eyes widened. "Then can she stay forever?" Richard smiled, a small, genuine smile that felt new on his face. "I hope she does." Maria let out a shaky laugh through her tears. "I would be honored to stay." And just like that, something shifted inside the Lockwood mansion. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. No thunderclap, no grand gesture, but it was real. The walls that had once echoed with prejudice now held something far stronger: forgiveness, understanding, and a chance to begin again. As the three of them sat together in the soft glow of the setting sun, Richard realized something he had never truly understood before: love wasn't a threat. It wasn't something that could taint or corrupt. It was the only thing that could heal. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to let it.